Hello everyone, and welcome back to Shipwreck Tale. In today's video, we dive into another chapter of unsettling disappearances events that not only defy explanation, but leave behind a haunting sense of mystery. The final story in this collection stands as one of the most chilling, both in setting and circumstance, so viewer discretion is advised. Hidden deep within the serene beauty of England's Lake District National Park lies a body of water that few dare to fully explore, water spanning nearly 3 kilometers. It's not the longest lake in the region, but at over 260 feet deep, it's the deepest in all of England. Its cold, dark waters have long served as a training ground for military divers, rescue teams, and professionals testing their endurance and techniques. In October 1976, a team of divers regulars to the lake were navigating a submerged ledge. Near the deepest section, when they noticed something strange resting on the rock shelf, it was a bulky, oval-shaped bundle about 3 feet long and wrapped tightly in carpet. Fabric and layers of electrical tape, all cinched down with rope. Oddly heavy for its size, the object gave off a mysterious and unnerving aura. Curiously, the divers had no idea what was inside. But instead of reporting the discovery, they began using the bundle as a makeshift training tool, simulating rescue exercises by dragging it through the water as though it were an unconscious diver. This practice continued, unintentionally turning a potentially sinister object into part of their routine. What they didn't know at the time was that the bundle held a horrifying secret one that would only come to light later, turning the peaceful waters of water into the scene of one of the UK's most disturbing underwater discoveries. Each time the training sessions ended, the divers faithfully returned the heavy bundle to the underwater ledge where they had first discovered it. Oddly, no one ever questioned what it really was. In that part of the Lake District, it wasn't uncommon for locals to wrap deceased pets in cloth or carpet, weigh them down with bricks, and quietly lower them into the lake's depths. Divers had found similar parcels before, most of them small and unmistakably related to animals. This particular bundle was different, larger, heavier, and oddly well sealed. Still, it was ignored. Until something strange happened years later. In 1983, a young French woman, just 21 years old, vanished while exploring the area around the lake. She was fit and experienced, used to hiking in the Alps, and had joined a casual group hike after meeting fellow travelers in the area. Despite the language barrier, she was outgoing and friendly, eager to experience the stunning wilderness. Somewhere during the hike, however, she drifted away from the group, whether by accident or design, no one could say for sure. At first, her fellow hikers assumed she had gone off on a solo detour and would rejoin them later. But when she didn't appear at the rendezvous point that evening, concern turned to alarm. 2 days later, her parents growing anxious in Paris called local authorities to report her missing. What followed was a massive search effort. Tracking dogs, aerial patrols, experienced mountaineers and divers all scoured the area. Was's water was thoroughly searched. Still, no trace of the young woman was ever found. She had vanished without a clue. Then, in February 1984, nearly 5 months after her disappearance, an amateur diver returned to a familiar site in Wastwadatha, ledge where that peculiar heavy bundle had been resting for years. It was the same bundle divers had been unknowingly using for training since 1976. Divers had unknowingly used the bundle as a practice weight for years since October 1976, hauling it up and down as part of their training routines. But this time, something felt off to one diver. Unlike the others before him, he hesitated. The package seemed too well wrapped, too heavy and far too intact to simply be dismissed. Acting on instinct, he reported it to the local police, suggesting it could possibly contain human remains, maybe even the body of the missing French tourist. That same afternoon, a police diving team was dispatched to retrieve it. Once it was brought to the surface, it only took a few strategic cuts and careful unwrapping to reveal the truth. Inside the bundle were the unmistakable remains of a woman. She hadn't been in the water long, judging by the condition of the body. In fact, her features were disturbingly well preserved, so much so that her mascara was still clearly visible. But one thing was immediately obvious. This was not the missing 21-year-old tourist. The woman inside the bundle was much older, likely middle-aged. As investigators examined the body more closely, they noticed something glinting on her finger: wedding ring. And etched on the inside of the band was a name and date: Margaret 151163. Peter. This small inscription was the first clue to her identity. The woman would come to be known as Margaret, though much of her life remains clouded in mystery. Records show she had married a man named Peter Hogg on November 15, 1963. At the time, Margaret had worked as a stewardess, and Peter, nearly 2 decades her senior, was an airline pilot. Over the years, they've built a seemingly stable life together, raising 2 children and moving through the ranks of the airline industry. But behind the appearances, trouble was brewing. By 1973, their marriage had begun to fall apart, and Margaret had secretly started an affair with an American man. The man Margaret had fallen for was a wealthy banker she met during a transatlantic flight. Their affair wasn't hidden for long. Margaret flaunted the relationship so openly that Peter learned about it almost immediately. Though crushed, Peter chose not to confront her at first. He tried to maintain peace in the home for the sake of their 2 children. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford for long. Margaret's behavior only became more provocative. Whenever they were home together, which thankfully wasn't often due to their conflicting work schedules, arguments erupted. She would taunt Peter with details about her affair, pushing his buttons with ruthless precision. These verbal confrontations sometimes turned physical, and yet for 3 long years, they continued living under the same roof, locked in a toxic and unraveling relationship. Then in October of 1976, something snapped. Margaret returned home after spending a week away. With her lover in Dorset, she walked in as casually as ever, not expecting anything unusual. But that night would be the last time anyone outside the household ever saw her. From that point forward, she vanished. Peter told friends and neighbors that Margaret had simply left him for good, run off with her lover, abandoning him and their children. But strangely, he didn't report her missing until nearly a month later. Only after meeting with a solicitor to initiate divorce proceedings did he finally contact the authorities. The police did what they could to locate her, but without any evidence of foul play or even proof she hadn't left voluntarily, there was little they could do. At the time, her disappearance seemed like nothing more than a messy end to a crumbling marriage. But now, years later, her body had surfaced in a lake, and suddenly everything Peter had claimed was unraveling fast. At the time of her disappearance, there were no signs of foul play, no suspicious circumstances, no blood, no struggle, just an empty house and a woman who had seemingly chosen to leave. Authorities accepted Peter's account. Margaret had left him for someone else. Without any evidence to suggest otherwise, her case quietly faded into the background. By mid-1977, it was simply assumed that Margaret had begun a new life somewhere far away. But that assumption was shattered nearly 8 years later, when the bundle from the bottom of the lake was finally opened and the news of its grim contents aired on local broadcasts. Several people recognized something familiar. Friends and relatives reached out to investigators, pointing to the ring found on the woman's finger. Inscribed inside were the names Margaret and Peter, along with the date, the 15th of November, 63. Marriage records confirmed that this was Margaret Hogg. Dental records later sealed the identification. Once authorities had confirmation, their attention turned sharply back to her husband, Peter Hogg, the man who had insisted she had left voluntarily all those years ago. Without warning, they arrived at his home and delivered the news. His wife had been found, but not alive. Peter was visibly shaken, but remained adamant he had nothing to do with her disappearance or death. His story hadn't changed since 1976. But this time, detectives didn't just accept his word. A forensic search of the home revealed dark secrets buried beneath the surface. Blood residue beneath the master bedroom carpet, rope fibers in the garage, and cloth that matched exactly what had been used to wrap Margaret's body. On March 4th, 1984, Peter Hogg, now 57 years old, was arrested and formally charged with murder. In court, his defense attorney painted a picture of a man pushed to his emotional limits, betrayed, humiliated, and emotionally abused by a wife who openly flaunted her affair. They claimed Peter had suffered quietly for years until something within him finally broke. But that narrative began to unravel when Margaret's lover took the stand. When Margaret's lover took the witness stand, he recounted their week-long getaway to Dorset just days before she vanished. He remembered Margaret returning to her marital home afterward, seemingly emboldened by the trip. He believed that her unexpected reappearance had likely triggered the volatile chain of events that followed. Despite his initial denial, the evidence had cornered Peter. Faced with mounting proof, both forensic and circumstantial, he knew there was no escaping the truth. Eventually, he chose to tell the court his version of what happened the night Margaret died. He described a confrontation that erupted as soon as Margaret stepped through the door. Tensions flared, as they often did, and Peter claimed that the argument quickly spiraled into chaos. He said Margaret insulted him viciously, hurled objects, scratched his face, and even struck him below the belt. According to Peter, he snapped, throwing a punch, then wrapping his hands around her neck. By the time he realized what he had done, it was too late. Margaret collapsed, motionless. Peter told the courtroom that in that moment, a terrible choice presented itself. He could confess, face prison, and abandon his children, or he could hide what had happened and try to move on. That night, driven by panic and desperation, he made his decision. He wrapped Margaret's body in a dry cleaning bag, curled her into a fetal position around a concrete weight, and then bound everything tightly with carpet, rope, and electrical tape. In the early hours of the morning, he drove to Wastwater, rowed out to a deep ledge in the lake, and dropped the bundle into the darkness below. Peter loaded the tightly wrapped bundle into the back of his car, along with a small inflatable boat, and began a tense overnight drive nearly 270 miles north. Just before sunrise, under the pale light of dawn, he launched the dinghy into Wastwater. Believing he'd found the lake's deepest point, he rowed out, fighting exhaustion and dread, before he finally released the bundle into the icy abyss. He later told the jury it was the longest night of his life. His nerves were so frayed that he nearly tipped over the dinghy while trying to lower the weighted package into the lake. In court, Peter claimed it wasn't premeditated murder. He insisted it was a crime of passion, a tragic lapse in control. During a moment of emotional eruption, not a calculated act. To the shock and disbelief of Margaret's family and friends, the jury accepted this version of events. After a surprisingly brief deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty, but not of murder of manslaughter. In the end, Peter was sentenced to 3 years for taking Margaret's life and another year for lying under oath and obstructing the coroner's inquiry during the divorce process he initiated just days after her death. Had the bundle not landed on a narrow ledge above the lake's deepest trench, Margaret's body might never have been found, and Peter's secret might have remained buried forever. As for the missing French tourist whose disappearance years later reignited interest in the lake, a breakthrough came in May 1985. A 53-year-old hiker discovered her skeletal remains, scattered across a boulder field nearly 1,000 feet above Wastwater. The injuries told a grim story. She had likely fallen from a great height, a tragic accident that inadvertently helped bring justice to another woman long forgotten beneath the water. It was a scene no one could forget, one that would quietly haunt a small prairie town long after the media left. On April 13, 1977, Charlie and Mavis returned to an old farm property they'd once owned, located about 8 miles outside Tofield, Alberta. Their goal was simple: to retrieve a septic tank pump they hoped to reuse instead of buying a new one. But what they stumbled upon was far more horrifying than anything they imagined. Instead of old equipment, they spotted something pale breaking the surface of the grimy water inside the septic tank. First glance, it looked like a foot. Still connected to a leg, it floated lifelessly just beneath the surface, half submerged in the dark sludge. The couple initially hoped it was some cruel pranks, something fake meant to scare trespassers, but deep down, they sensed the truth. Panicked, They drove straight to the nearby RCMP station in Towfield and alerted the authorities. 2 officers immediately followed them back to the property. What they found was more nightmarish than anyone could have expected. The septic tank, around 6 feet deep and long forgotten, wasn't just holding contaminated water. Emerging from it was the unmistakable outline of a human limb bloated from decomposition. The body it was attached to had been jammed into the tank headfirst, wrapped in a faded yellow bed sheet and bound tightly with nylon rope. Time and moisture had already begun erasing clues, but the scene made one thing painfully clear: this was no accident. With no protective gear or proper tools, the responding officers were ill-prepared for what lay before them. And yet, they knew this wasn't something they could walk away from. Whoever this was, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure they were never found again. With nothing but an old ice cream pail they'd scrounged from the property, the officers began the grim task of removing the foul liquid one scoop at a time. It took them more than an hour of painstaking, stomach-turning labor trading off. As the stench became unbearable until they could finally extract the human remains tangled at the bottom, what they recovered was gruesome. Word of the grisly discovery spread quickly, and before long, headlines across Alberta were calling the unknown victim Septic Tank Sam. It was a placeholder name for a man who had clearly endured one of the most horrifying deaths in provincial history. There was no identification, no driver's license, no scraps of paper or names stitched into clothing. Just a nameless corpse, abandoned in a forgotten septic tank, left to rot in secret for what could have been years. But even in those early hours of investigation, detectives recognized this wasn't some careless, spontaneous act. The killer hadn't just wanted this man dead, they wanted him erased. And more disturbingly, they wanted him to suffer first. Investigators examined what little the body had to offer. He was dressed plainly, the kind of clothes you'd expect from a man used to hard labor: a snap-button denim shirt, a plain gray undershirt, well-worn blue jeans, full leather shoes. No branding, no logos, no unique identifiers. Everything was rugged, simple, and painfully common. Whoever he was, he blended in possibly by design. But there was one crucial mistake. The killer had attempted to accelerate decomposition by covering the body in quickly chemical, often assumed to dissolve remains. But in reality, when exposed to moisture, quicklime can do the opposite. It slows decomposition by preserving tissues and hardening the outer layers. Instead of removing evidence, it preserved it. Because of that error, authorities now had a better chance at uncovering what happened to the man they'd soon come to realize had endured unspeakable cruelty before he was finally discarded like garbage. Ironically, the same moisture that filled the tank had worked against the killer's intent. Rather than speeding up decay, it almost acted like a time capsule, preserving the body and sealing in the most damning evidence. What the murderer had tried to erase had, in fact, become the investigator's most valuable lead. Unfortunately, the septic tank itself remained silent. There were no bullet casings, no murder weapon, and no signs of a struggle. Everything about the scene suggested one chilling truth. This wasn't where the victim died, it was just where he was thrown away. With nothing from the crime scene to guide them, detectives shifted their focus to motive. The level of violence inflicted on the body wasn't consistent with a random act. It felt personal, rage-filled, intimate, possibly revenge, jealousy, or some twisted form of punishment. The post-mortem confirmed that theory. In a lab in Edmonton, the medical examiner began the daunting task of examining what remained of the body. At first, even determining the victim's ethnicity proved difficult due to advanced decomposition. He was originally thought to be an assumption that would later be proven incorrect and would seriously hinder early efforts to identify him. The official cause of death was eventually listed as gunshot trauma. At least 2 rounds from a .32 caliber handgun had struck the man, one in the chest, one in the head. But what truly haunted those involved wasn't how he died. It was what had been done to him before the shots were fired. He had been bound, tortured, and burned. Deliberate injuries cruelly inflicted far beyond what was needed to kill. Someone had made him suffer. Hewins told a story darker than anyone had expected. Scorch marks across the body indicated prolonged torture using both lit cigarettes and something far more intense, a butane torch. But that wasn't the full extent of the brutality. The damage was so extensive and so deliberately focused that for months, even the victim's gender wasn't confirmed. The level of mutilation was grotesque. Though the tools were never definitively identified, investigators believed something. As crude and horrifying as farm shears may have been used, eventually, after what can only be described as systematic torment, the man was dumped headfirst into the septic tank, doused in quicklime, and left in the dark, forgotten. But the body still had secrets to reveal. Despite the decomposition, the man's teeth were largely intact, showing signs of recent dental work. He had dark hair, an average build, and workman's clothing typical of someone used to physical labor. Based on this, police speculated that he might have been a drifter, a seasonal farmhand, or a transient laborer, someone whose absence wouldn't raise alarm too quickly. Tofield itself was a quiet place, but it sat within reach of Edmonton, a city bustling enough that someone could drift through unnoticed. So the key to unraveling this horrific case would depend on answering the most basic but crucial question: who was this man? 2 years after the discovery, in 1979, investigators exhumed his remains from the unmarked plot where he had been quietly laid to rest in Edmonton. His bones were sent to Oklahoma, where 2 of the continent's leading forensic specialists took on the case. Their expertise? Reconstructing faces from fractured skulls, giving identity to the long-forgotten. In Oklahoma, 2 of North America's leading forensic experts began the painstaking task of rebuilding a face from fragments of bone using 3D facial reconstruction. Their goal wasn't to give the man a name, but a face that could finally spark recognition. With careful measurements and analysis of bone structure, they molded a lifelike model, estimating that the victim was likely of indigenous descent and around 35 years old. This conclusion was a major correction to the RCMP's earlier assumption that he was Caucasian. But sadly, even with this new version of his face staring out from police bulletins, no one came forward. The mystery man, now given form but still nameless, was once again buried, his story incomplete. 2 more decades slipped by. Then in the year 2000, the case was reopened and the body was once again brought out of the ground. This time, a different kind of expert took on the challenge. Forensic artist Cyril Chan from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner set out to build a more accurate reconstruction using traditional clay modeling, working directly from the original skull. Cyril meticulously inserted pins to map out tissue, thickness, and spent weeks sculpting layer after layer of clay to represent muscle and skin. The resulting face looked more lifelike than ever before. This version made its way across news outlets, police flyers, and online databases. It felt like hope, but it wasn't enough. No one recognized the man. No family came forward. And septic Tank Sam remained without a name, just a haunting face and a horrifying story. Through all these years, the town of Tofield never fully shook the shadow of Septic Tank Sam. It wasn't just the horror of what happened, it was the intensity of it. It's the cruelty, the unknown. Local farmers, uneasy, started checking their own tanks out of sheer paranoia. Some business owners couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever unknowingly served coffee to a killer. Rumors grew like weeds. Whispers said it was a crime of passion, others called it vengeance, maybe even gang-related payback. But none of that mattered, not without a name. Then in 2018, everything changed. It's not just for Septic Tank Sam, but for the world of cold cases. That year, a breakthrough in California shook the entire investigative community. Authorities finally identified the elusive Golden State Killer using a method few had dared to imagine would work: forensic genealogy. By uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, detectives could trace bloodlines and build family trees, solving cases once thought impossible. Inspired by this, the Alberta RCMP's Missing Persons Unit decided to give it one more shot. In 2019, they retrieved Sam's decades-old, degraded DNA sample and ran it through Canada's national database. Nothing. No match. A complete dead end. But the team wasn't ready to give up. In 2020, they partnered with a private lab in Texas, Othram, Inc., a company known for extracting miracles from genetic material that most would call hopeless. The lab's experts began the painstaking process of reconstructing a viable DNA profile from what little they had. Against the odds, they succeeded. With that new profile in hand, investigators uploaded the data into public genealogy databases. From there, they started to carefully assemble a family tree, one relative at a time, inching closer to the identity that had eluded them for over 40 years. As investigators traced the new DNA profile outward, mapping relatives and searching for connections, the puzzle began to take shape. By October 2020, more than 4 decades after that body was discovered in a forgotten septic tank, they finally had a name. Septic Tank Sam was Gordon Sanderson, or Gordy to those who knew him. He was just 26 years old, an indigenous man. From Manitoba, when he vanished sometime in the mid-1970s, the long-awaited breakthrough was confirmed when the RCMP contacted surviving family members. His older sister helped verify what DNA had already proven. Then, on June 29, 2021, nearly 44 years after he was dumped and discarded like trash, the Alberta RCMP publicly restored his name to the record. His identity, once erased by violence and time, was spoken again. What made this even more painful was that Gordy's family had tried to report him missing all those years ago. But the pieces were never connected. Investigators had wrongly profiled the body as Caucasian, and because of that, they never even considered looking for an indigenous man. But now, with his name known, everything changed. For the first time, it was no longer about Septic Tank Sam. It was about Gordy. A brother, a son, a human being. Unfortunately, justice is still waiting. The case remains open, and authorities believe more than one person may have been responsible for what happened to him. While detectives continue their search for those behind his death, Gordy's story can finally be told. He was born on October 22, 1950, in Manitoba. And like far too many Indigenous children of his time, his childhood was derailed by a devastating government policy known as the 60s Scupa system that stripped thousands of Native children from their homes and placed them in non-Indigenous foster families, often hundreds of miles away. From the 1960s through the 1980s, thousands of Indigenous children like Gordy were taken from their homes. Many, including Gordy at just 9 years old, were removed from their families and placed in foster care or adopted out of into white middle-class households. The damage it caused would last a lifetime. Gordy grew up disconnected from his culture, alone in unfamiliar spaces and burdened with trauma. By the 1970s, he was living in Edmonton, drifting from place to place. He battled substance issues and did what he could to survive. Police had his name in their files, but only from small, non-violent encounters. The last anyone in his family heard, Gordy was headed to Calgary to visit his younger brother. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a simple trip to reconnect. But somewhere along the way, he disappeared. Years passed and his sister tried to find him. She filed a missing persons report, desperate for answers. But those answers never came because the man found in the septic tank had been misclassified from the start. Even if someone was looking for Gordy, the trail didn't lead back to that rural farm outside Tofield. So when the RCMP finally identified him in 2021, the truth landed hard. There was a measure of peace in knowing what happened, but also grief, anger, and disbelief. Nearly half a century had passed. Justice had been delayed. In the process, Gordy's name had been lost, replaced with a cruel placeholder that defined him by how he was discarded. But Gordy Sanderson was more than that. He was a brother, a son, a survivor of a broken system. And now finally, his story is being told as it always should have been. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful and heartbreaking case. If you'd like to suggest a story, the link is in the description. And if you'd like to help us continue sharing voices like Gordy's, consider supporting the channel through Patreon or by becoming a member here on YouTube. Take care. We'll see you in the next story.